Generations are like people. They have personalities. Those of us who are baby boomers know that well. And as I look over the audience, I do see quite a few baby boomers out there. You can't hide it from me. I've known you for too long. In a few minutes, you're going to hear from, and by the way, this is the sort of thing that we at the Pew Research Center love to look at. Generations are the product of a moment in history, and they drive history, and looking at the kind of social, cultural, political changes that brings about is at the very center of what we do. In just a few minutes, you're going to hear from Paul Taylor, who has a new book out this week, The Next America. All of you are going to get copies of this book before you leave today, but then we expect you to go home to your offices or your homes and buy 10 more copies and give them to all your friends and relatives. Paul will be watching the Amazon numbers to make sure you do so. Mike Murphy tweeted earlier in the week that every member of Congress should read this book. We think every American citizen should read this book, so we urge you to help us do it. It's based on a trove of Pew Research Center data and tells a compelling story. Also this morning we put out a new report, Millennials in Adulthood, that builds on some of these trends, and Paul will talk about some of that in his comments in just a minute. After Paul's presentation, we have two stellar panels to discuss this. One panel this morning will focus on social, cultural, and religious change. The second panel later on will focus on political and policy changes resulting from generational change. Somewhere in between, we will, or Wolfgang Puck will serve you lunch. The one thing we ask of you in return for all of this generosity on our part is that you engage in the discussion. We believe in the power of information. We like to put facts on the table. We'd like our distinguished panelists and you to discuss, debate, analyze, and hopefully by the time we get to 1:30, we will all be a little bit wiser for it. So thank you again for coming, and Paul, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Demographic transformations are dramas in slow motion. No one announces them with a drum roll, a bugle call, or a press conference, but they remake societies in fundamental ways, and America is in the midst of two such dramas right now. Our population is becoming majority non-white. At the same time, our record share is going gray. The America of the near future is going to look nothing like the America of the recent past. And these shifts are creating big generation gaps that will put stress on our families, our politics, our pocketbooks, our entitlement programs, and perhaps our social cohesion. Even though they happen all around us, these transformations are often hard to see. That's the nature of demographic churn. It comes tick by tick in nearly imperceptible increments. But every so often, societies have aha moments. And we had a few just last month when three of the most iconic American consumer brands, Coke, Chevy, and Cheerios, rolled out ads during the Super Bowl and the Olympics that showed a very different America from the one they portrayed in their ads 50 years ago. Let's take a look.
While what it means to be a family hasn't changed, what a family looks like has. This is the new us.
The new us. Product advertisers aren't in the business of making political statements. And when they're spending $4 million on a 30-second spot, they're certainly not in the business of making enemies. And if the new us is interracial couples and same-sex parents and America the Beautiful sung in several languages, they surely knew that they were going to get some blowback. And sure enough, it came to some degree in the Twitter sphere and in some outposts of the traditional media. But these advertisers also do their homework, they do their focus groups, and most of all, they look at the numbers. And they know how fast our nation is changing, especially our racial complexion. In 1960, the population in the United States was 85% white. By 2060, it will be 43% white. And it's not just that we're becoming less white, it's that we're becoming more like a rainbow. This makeover is being driven mainly by the more than 40 million immigrants who have come to our country in a great wave that's now nearly a half century old and still going strong. In previous centuries, our big immigration waves were almost entirely made up of Europeans. In the late 19th century, it was the Irish and the Germans coming from Western Europe. Then in the early 20th century, it was the Italians, the Polish, the Jews coming from Eastern Europe. And now our modern wave. It's half Hispanic, it's more than a quarter Asian, it's only 12% European. But some things don't change, no matter where they come from. Immigrants are strivers, they're optimists, they believe in the future, and they tend to have a lot of kids. So here's, if we go back to 1960, about 1/5 of our population was made up of immigrants or their children. If we project forward, based on current trends, to 2050, 37% of our country will be made up of immigrants and their children. But understand, this actually isn't really new. We've always been a nation of immigrants, and the low ratios in the middle of the 20th century weren't the norm, they were the exception. We were at about more than a third of immigrant stock in the late 19th and early 20th century. We closed our doors to immigration in the 1920s. They stayed closed through the Depression. They stayed closed through World War II. In the mid-60s, we opened our doors back up, and we were, in effect, going back to the future. And once again, immigration, as it has always been, is an engine that changes, that makes and remakes America. Now let's think a little bit about the makeup of this new Rainbow America. Here's what it's going to look like in 2060. But actually, here's an interesting question. By then, will these racial categories even make much sense? Nowadays, our old labels are having trouble keeping up with our new weddings. A half a century ago, racial intermarriage was still illegal in about a third of the states, and it was a gasp-inducing taboo almost everywhere else. Today, nearly 1 in 6 newlyweds marries across racial or ethnic lines. More than a quarter of Hispanics and Asians, newlyweds, marry out, as do 1 in 6 blacks and 1 in 10 whites. Now, whites are still the largest race group in the country, so even though they marry out at lower rates, they still account for 70%, or they're still one of the spouses in 70% of all interracial marriages. Here's another interesting question. What are we going to call the children of these marriages? Well, today, we actually aren't even sure what to call the President of the United States. Shortly after Barack Obama was elected, we asked people, what do you think? Is he mostly a mixed race or is he mostly black? And we got whites saying mostly mixed race and blacks saying mostly black, but we got significant majorities of each group saying it was the other way around. We do know this, that in most of human history, being mixed race, being a mutt, as President Obama sometimes likes to call himself, has meant being an outcast. In today's America, judging from those Super Bowl ads and judging from this sort of A-list lineup of mixed race celebrities, those norms are changing and those stigmas are receding. Okay, on to the next drama. As we become more multicolored, we're also getting grayer. I speak from experience. This is what demographers call an age pyramid. All these horizontal bars, each one of them represents a 5-year age cohort, with the 0 to 4s at the bottom and the 85 pluses at the top. In every society, this is what we looked like in 1960. This was the distribution by age. In every society since the start of human history, it's always been a pyramid. Here we were in 1850. You advance to 1900, you see the angles of the pyramid change a little bit because people are living later in life, but it's a pyramid. Always has been. All right, let's go back to 1960 and take a look at what happens to our age pyramid in the coming century. it becomes a rectangle. By 2060, we'll have about as many people over the age of 85 as we have under the age of 5. This is uncharted territory, not only for us, but for all of humanity. It's the product of dramatic increases in life expectancy and dramatic declines in fertility. And again, this new geometry of aging isn't unfolding only in the United States. These changes actually are even more dramatic across all of Europe and most of Asia. So here's what China looks like in 2060. And now we're losing the rectangle and we're moving towards a top-heavy trapezoid. Here's Germany in 2060. And here is Japan in 2060. Japan is already and will continue to be the oldest country in human history. Its median age in 2060 will be an astonishing 53 compared with our 41. You know, if you don't have enough old people, if you don't have enough young people to take care of old people as a society, you have to make some adjustments, you have to improvise. Small wonder that Japan is already leading the world in the manufacture of caretaker robots. They are also leading the world, certainly among advanced countries, in their share of debt to GDP. We have a very big one, as everybody in Washington knows. It's about 100%. In Japan, it's 200%. In many ways, these demographic changes are a high-class problem. The population of the planet increased fourfold in the 20th century, and because of these changes, especially decreased birth rates, it's only going to increase about 50% in this century before stabilizing perhaps by the end of the century. Spoiler or a caveat, the projections that far into the distance need to be taken with a grain of salt. But over the long haul, these changes are surely good for the sustainability of our planet. But in the short and medium term, it presents economic and political challenges, especially in countries such as ours that are about to have large cohorts entering retirement and smaller ones in the workforce. Pretty soon, we'll have to rebalance our entitlement programs to bring them in sync with our new demographics. This is going to be a painful process because it's going to require nothing but unpleasant choices, big benefit cuts, big tax increases, or both. But in tomorrow's, it's going to have to be done in tomorrow's America. Yesterday's math doesn't work. Now, before we explore these challenges, let's meet the cast of characters, the four generations that are going to have to work all this out. Here they are. Here they are in terms of their size. And let's start with the Millennials. They range in age from mid-teens to early 30s. They have come of age in the digital era, the rise of the internet, the advent of social networks. They're sometimes referred to as digital natives. They don't have to adapt to these miraculous new technologies. It's all they've ever known. 8 in 10 of them are on Facebook, where their median friend count is 250, which is about 5 times the friend count of the fewer numbers of boomers who are in these places. And they are also quite distinctive in the way that they engage with their friends, their many friends in these networks. So much so that the Oxford Dictionary declared selfie the word of the year in 2013. We all enjoyed Oscar's selfie moment at the, Ellen DeGeneres' selfie moment at the Oscars last weekend. It's pretty cool. She's a card-carrying boomer, but she took a page from the Millennials Handbook, and she knows what she's doing. Here are the share of other generations that have taken and shared a selfie. Indeed, when we asked people, and we asked this question just a week or two before the Oscars, you know what a selfie is? And only about half of boomers and about a third of millennials even know what the word is. Oxford Dictionary's word of the year. Millennials are the most diverse generation in our country's history. More than 10 are non-white. But in this sense, they're a transitional generation of children born today in this country. About half are non-white. Then they are also slow to reach many of the traditional milestones of adulthood. They're slow to get jobs, they're slow to buy houses and cars, and they are slow to marry. This is the share, just about a quarter of millennials ages 18 to 22 are married today. Look at the marriage rates of the older generations back when they were the age that millennials are now. Quite an extraordinary difference. It's not, and we have because they're slow to marry. We've asked millennials, why aren't you married? And we find that about 2/3 of the unmarried millennials say, I want to get married. I expect to get married. So what's holding you back? And overwhelmingly, the response is, I don't have the economic foundation to be a good provider for a family. And this is another big change that happens. In the past half century, marriage rates have declined for all groups, but they have declined much more heavily for those at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. So when people don't marry and they're in their 20s and 30s, they have kids anyway, and this is another extraordinary change that we're seeing. The births to unmarried women in 1960, 5% of all children were born to single moms. Today, 41% of all children are born to single moms, and it is the millennial generation that is at the leading edge of this trend. But interestingly, when we asked millennials, is this a good thing or a bad thing for society? Millennials, like all older adults, in large numbers say, no, this is a bad thing. So this is a behavioral change at a time when more traditional norms are still in force. When they say they don't have the economic foundation, many of them are right. This generation, as it's now aging into adulthood, stands out as the first generation in modern history that is starting out in life with more difficult economic circumstances than their parents and perhaps even their grandparents, certainly than their parents did. So two statistics paint the picture. They've started in their economic lives during the terrible economy of the last 5 or 6 years. Unemployment rates very high among young adults. It's a well-known story. A little bit less well-known, actually, is if you break the older group of the millennial generation, the 25 to 32s, presumably they are through their formal education, they're in the workforce. If you break them by their educational attainment, the unemployment rate for those with a college degree or more is actually more respectable. It's down around 4%. Among high school or less, it's 12%. So in a knowledge-based economy, the penalties for not going further in education have gotten stiffer and stiffer. The gap has gotten very wide in this generation. But it's not all rosy for those who have gone to college, because the other extraordinary change over this last decade or two is the rise of student loan debt. So today, millennials, college graduates, about 2/3 of them have student loan debt, and this is their median. Two decades ago, only about half of college graduates had student loan debt, and this was their inflation-adjusted debt. So you have a generation that has plenty of economic hardship, is having a very hard time getting started in this economy. But it's interesting, despite their economic woes, millennials are the nation's most stubborn optimists. They believe the nation's best days are ahead. They believe their own best days are ahead. And when we ask adults of all ages, do you think you have enough money now, or do you think you eventually will have enough money to lead the life you want to lead? More than 8 in 10 millennials say yes. Now, when we've asked older generations that question when they were younger, we got the same registration of optimism. Maybe it's just the invincibility of youth, but it's interesting that it persists even in the hard times that these kids are experiencing. Okay, let's move up. The next oldest generation are the Gen Xers. They're in their 30s and 40s now. Numbers-wise, actually, they're a relatively small generation. They're sometimes called the baby busters. They were children of the Reagan Revolution and the divorce revolution. Generational personality to stereotypes, savvy, cynical problem solvers. When it comes to economic issues and the role of government, they tilt conservative, but on most social issues, they tilt more liberal, and they tend to be closer to the millennials than to older generations. They are not without their economic concerns, and when we asked people a year or two ago about, do you think you'll have enough money for your own retirement? It's the Gen Xers now in their 30s and 40s, as they've gotten past the trial of getting into the workforce, and they're starting to look ahead, and they feel like they're behind. Very high numbers of them say, no, I don't think I'm going to have enough trouble for my retirement. Speaking of retirement, the next oldest generation are the baby boomers. They came of age during that big spike in fertility. You may remember this slide from a few slides before that began right after the soldiers came home from World War II, and it continued until the birth control pill came on the market. And for demographers, this is a very unusual 18 or 20 years. True to their name, they didn't enter the scene quietly. They're famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, for leading the countercultural protests during the turbulent 1960s. But it's interesting, we just asked in this new report, we asked adults of all ages, do you think over the course of your lifetime you've gotten more liberal, more conservative, or stayed about the same? More than half of boomers say I've gotten more conservative, only about a third say I've gotten more liberal. So this is a cautionary tale. This is one of the great questions about millennials and any young age group. Are their attitudes baked in for the long haul? And the answer is maybe. We don't know. The other salient fact and number about baby boomers is the fact that they are crossing the threshold into old age. So today, 10,000 baby boomers will turn 65. Tomorrow, another 10,000 baby boomers will turn 65. Sunday, another 10,000. Well, I will be one of them. And this will go on every single day until the year 2030. By which time we as a society will have to deal with some very challenging new math. Here is the worker to beneficiary ratio. This is something that the people who run the Social Security system and the people down there think about and worry about a whole lot. If you go back to 1960, we had 5 workers per Social Security beneficiary. If you go back to 2010, we had about 3 workers per Social Security beneficiary. By 2030, we will have 2 workers per every Social Security beneficiary. And at that point, Social Security and Medicare will both be broke. Boomers aren't the only ones on Social Security, of course. The oldest Americans are known as the silent generation. Most are now in their 70s and 80s. They started their adult lives in a very different time, the 1950s. They were conservative, conformist. They moved out to the suburbs that were sprouting up all over the country. They came of age at a time when the middle class was expanding, when our standard of living was rising, our income gaps were shrinking. But they also came of age at a time when women, minorities, and gays weren't able to chase all of their dreams. So it was a very different America. And you can see that actually in their racial profile. About 8 in 10 silents are white, making them a very faithful portrait of the America of the 1960s, but not so much of the America of today. Here's another thing that's notable about the silent generation. Even though everybody has economic anxieties, they are the one generation over the last decades that has actually done better than their same age cohort did a generation or two before. So here are the median wealth of households by our 4 different generations. You see there's an enormous gap. There's nothing unusual about the size of this gap. It happens naturally. People tend to build asset and wealth through the course of their life cycles. The size of this gap is unusual. It is twice as big as it was a generation ago. Relative to younger adults 20 years ago, today's younger adults have less wealth. Relative to older adults 20 years ago, today's older adults have more wealth. And you can run those same comparisons across a lot of other indicators, and you get this same rising disparity in economic well-being by generation. But while they are arguably the most economically secure generation, they are also the most disoriented by the rapid pace of change. They're least supportive, for example, of gay marriage. Their views on unauthorized immigrants are different from those of younger generations. They're less likely to say that they should be allowed to stay in the country. But I find this an interesting slide. This adds up to a pretty broad consensus across all generations that unauthorized immigrants are here. We should figure out a way to normalize and legalize them. Our friends down the street here have been hard-pressed to get that memo, unfortunately. Okay, given all these generation gaps in social attitudes, racial identity, family structure, economic well-being, it's hardly a surprise that in the past few elections, the young-old partisan voting gap is the biggest in our history. So here you're looking at the way ages 18 to 29-year-olds vote for the Democratic candidate for president over the last 30 years, whoever he was. And there you look at the green line is how the 65 and overs voted. You see, for most of the 80s, 90s, and early aughts, there was virtually no difference. In the last 2 or 3 presidential elections, certainly the 2 Obama presidential elections, we open up a big chasm. And part of that chasm is reflected in all the generational differences we're talking about. Thus, the challenge ahead, at a time when our generations don't look alike, don't think alike, don't vote alike, how do we rebalance the social safety net in a way that keeps pace with the old without bankrupting the young and starving the future? We look forward today to the 2 panels of thoughtful leaders from many fields and many generations who are going to explore this challenge from many perspectives. But before we kick off the proceedings, let me close this opening tour on a hopeful note. Are we fated to fight a battle of the ages over these issues? I would say not necessarily. A war needs combatants. And we find very little evidence from our Pew Research surveys that old and young are spoiling for a fight on these issues. One reason, it's hard to wage a generation war when you're living under the same roof. As I said, about 40% of millennials have boomeranged back home to live with mom and dad. This is a pattern that was more prevalent in an older America. It came out of fashion. When we passed Social Security and Medicare, Grandma and Grandpa had the financial security to go live by themselves. The nuclear family was the nuclear family. The kids moved out of the household once they got out of school. That was the way the rules worked. That started to change about 20 or 30 years ago for lots of reasons that we've discussed. And this is a pattern, actually, that's somewhat economically driven, but somewhat culturally driven. Some of you probably know, in Italy, for example, the share of young adults, particularly young men who live with their parents well into their 30s, is north of 50 or 60%. Bambocinis, they're called, big babies, or mamismos, mama's boys. But these are terms really of endearment. This is the way the world works, and everybody is sort of cool with it. And I'm struck by the fact that when we looked for signs of stress in these boomeranger households, we've done a couple of surveys on this, we were really hard-pressed to find any. I speak as a boomer, loved my parents, but I came of age at a time in the 60s when one of the rallying cries was never trust anybody over 30. And our generation was pretty convinced that our parents' generation and grandparents' generation had pretty much screwed everything up, and thank goodness we had come along to set things right. So there was sort of a whiff of generation war in the ether. We don't find any of that today. When we asked these kids about what's it like to live at home, is it tough? And they're fine. The refrigerator is stocked. You don't have to put coins in to make the washing machine work. When we asked them which generation has better moral values, 8 in 10 millennials say our parents. And then when we ask adults of all ages if they see strong conflicts these days between young and old, we actually got very few takers, especially when compared with other potential societal conflicts. Thus the hopeful note. If America can bring to the public square this same genius for intergenerational dependence and harmony that they're experiencing every day in their lives at home, the politics of these issues will be less toxic and the policy choices less daunting. That's a big if, but it's a good place to start. Thank you very much.